Hey guys, tonight we're taking a truly chilling journey back to the sun-drenched sands and monumental grandeur of ancient Egypt, a civilization famed for its pharaohs, its pyramids, and its meticulously ordered society. But we're not focusing on their gods or their grand achievements. Instead, we're pulling back the linen curtain to uncover the brutal punishments you faced for minor crimes in Egypt. Forget modern legal systems, due process, or proportional sentencing. You're about to discover a grim reality where a simple accusation, even for a trivial offense, could quickly lead to agonizing physical pain, permanent disfigurement, or even a slow, torturous death. This wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about swift, visible, and often horrifying deterrence. Frankly, you probably wouldn't survive a single accusation without longing for a swift, anonymous disappearance. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself suddenly standing in a bustling, dusty market square in an ancient Egyptian city, perhaps Thebes or Memphis, sometime during the New Kingdom, roughly 1550-1070 BCE, an era of immense power and prosperity. You are a common citizen, a farmer, a craftsman, or a laborer. Your life dictated by the rhythms of the Nile and the demands of your daily toil. Your greatest desire is to live peacefully, provide for your family, and avoid any attention from the authorities. But then, it happens. A misunderstanding, a petty dispute, a moment of weakness. And suddenly, you are accused. This is the fickle law of ancient Egypt, and a simple accusation can plunge you into a terrifying, unjust system where your nightmare truly begins. The accusation itself might be surprisingly minor. Perhaps you were caught stealing a few loaves of bread from a temple granary out of desperation during a lean season. Maybe you were accused of cheating on a debt, failing to pay back a loan in full. It could be a simple act of insubordination to a local official, a disrespectful word or glance, or even more sinister, a false accusation from a jealous neighbor, a disgruntled employer, or a rival seeking to settle a score. In ancient Egypt, formal legal evidence as we understand it was often rudimentary. Eyewitness testimony, even from a single accuser, could be sufficient to initiate proceedings. Your word, as a commoner, might carry little weight against that of someone with higher status. It truly sucked to be accused of petty theft. Once accused, you were immediately under the jurisdiction of the state, embodied by local officials, temple authorities, or royal administrators. Your case would be heard by a local court or kenbet, typically presided over by a panel of respected elders or officials. While these courts aimed to deliver justice according to Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and balance. The process was often swift, brutal, and heavily influenced by the social status of both the accused and the accuser. There were no complex legal codes read aloud, no lengthy appeals, no detailed evidence gathering in the modern sense. Justice was often delivered summarily. The concept of a minor crime in ancient Egypt was vastly different from today. What might seem like a petty offense to us, a small theft. A minor act of insolence could be seen as a disruption of Ma'at, a challenge to divine order, and thus warrant severe punishment. The state's power was absolute, flowing directly from the pharaoh, who was considered a living god. Any transgression, however small, could be interpreted as an affront to this divine authority, justifying extreme retribution. Your immediate problem would be the lack of legal representation or basic rights. There were no lawyers to defend you, no concept of innocent until proven guilty in the modern sense. You would stand alone before the court, expected to answer questions directly, with no one to guide you through the process or argue on your behalf. Confessions. Often coerced, were highly prized as proof of guilt. The burden of proving your innocence in a system stacked against you was immense. Imagine trying to explain yourself to stern officials who already viewed you with suspicion without anyone to speak up for you. It really sucked to be helpless before the law. The very process of interrogation could be terrifying. While not all interrogations involved torture for minor crimes, the threat of physical coercion was always present, especially if you denied the accusation. Officials might use intimidation, psychological pressure, or even physical beatings to extract a confession. The line between inquiry and punishment was often blurred, turning the initial stages of the legal process into a horrifying ordeal. The purpose of these brutal punishments, even for minor crimes, was clear deterrence. Ancient Egyptian society relied on strong visual and physical deterrence to maintain order and control its vast population. Punishments were often public, designed to instill fear in potential wrongdoers and to demonstrate the swift, unyielding power of the state. Your suffering, if condemned, would serve as a chilling lesson to all who witnessed it, ensuring compliance through terror. Your pain was a public service announcement. One common misconception is that all ancient Egyptian laws were explicitly written down in comprehensive codes like the Code of Hammurabi. While some legal texts and court records survive, much of ancient Egyptian law was based on customary law, royal decrees, and religious principles interpreted by local officials and priests. This decentralized and sometimes unwritten nature of the law could lead to inconsistencies and arbitrary application, especially for commoners. Justice was often less about strict legal precedent and more about maintaining social order and upholding the pharaoh's authority through pragmatic and often harsh means. Historians still meticulously study surviving legal papyri, court transcripts, and tomb inscriptions, which sometimes depict judicial scenes to understand the precise nature of ancient Egyptian law and its enforcement, often finding a system that prioritized order and swift resolution over individual rights. Furthermore, the social stratification of ancient Egypt meant that justice was often applied differently based on your status. While a noble might face fines or exile for a similar offense, a commoner was far more likely to endure physical punishment or forced labor. Your social standing, a matter of birth, played a crucial role in determining the severity of your sentence, ensuring that the burden of harsh justice fell disproportionately on the shoulders of the poor and powerless. This inherent bias made the system profoundly unfair. The psychological toll of being accused, of facing a terrifying legal process without rights, and of confronting the potential for brutal punishment would be immense. You would live with a constant sense of dread, your reputation shattered, and your future uncertain. The memory of your interrogation, the stern faces of the officials, and the fear of the unknown would haunt your waking hours. Long before any sentence was passed, this profound anxiety, this complete loss of control over your own fate, was a defining horror of medieval justice. So, your journey into ancient Egyptian punishment began not with a grand crime, but with a simple accusation that plunged you into a world of terrifying uncertainty. The fickle law, the absence of legal rights, and the immediate threat of brutal coercion made your encounter with ancient Egyptian justice a profoundly brutal and terrifying ordeal from the very first moment, setting the stage for the horrifying punishments that awaited you for even minor crimes. Having been accused and plunged into the terrifying reality of ancient Egyptian justice, you quickly faced the stark truth of your legal standing: no lawyers, no rights, Forget any modern notion of legal representation, due process, or the presumption of innocence. You were utterly helpless before the absolute authority of the state, making your encounter with the law profoundly brutal. Imagine standing before the local court or kenbet. This wasn't a formal courtroom with impartial judges and a jury. Instead, it was often a panel of local officials, respected elders or priests who served as arbiters. They might convene in a temple courtyard, a public square, or a simple administrative building. The atmosphere would be one of solemn authority, but also pervasive fear. You, the accused, would stand alone, without anyone by your side to guide you, advise you, or speak on your behalf. There was no concept of a defense lawyer or legal counsel to protect your interests. It truly sucked to be your own. Entirely unprepared. Legal team. Your accuser, on the other hand, might be a more powerful individual, a wealthy landowner, a temple official, or even a soldier. Their testimony, perhaps supported by a few witnesses who might be coerced or biased, would be presented directly to the court. You would be expected to respond, to answer questions, and to defend yourself verbally. However, your words, as a commoner, might carry little weight against someone of higher social status or influence. The system was inherently biased, favoring the powerful and the well-connected, leaving you, the humble accused, in a profoundly disadvantaged position. The burden of proof often rested squarely on you to demonstrate your innocence. The concept of innocent until proven guilty was not a universal principle in ancient legal systems. Instead, you were effectively presumed guilty until you could somehow convince the court otherwise, or until a confession was extracted. This reversal of burden made your situation even more precarious, forcing you into a desperate battle against skepticism and preconceived notions of your guilt. The process of interrogation was terrifying. While not all inquiries for minor crimes immediately resorted to torture, the threat of physical coercion was always present, especially if you denied the accusation. Officials might use intimidation, psychological pressure, or even direct physical beatings to extract a confession in ancient Egyptian legal thinking. A confession was often considered the most conclusive proof of guilt, simplifying the judicial process and providing undeniable evidence for the record. Imagine stern-faced officials questioning you relentlessly, their voices cold, their eyes unwavering, knowing that your continued denial might lead to increasingly painful methods of persuasion. It truly sucked when your testimony was extracted by a stick. For instance, judicial papyri contain accounts where officials explicitly state that a witness or an accused individual was beaten with rods to extract testimony or a confession. While such methods might have been officially reserved for more serious crimes or recalcitrant witnesses, the very knowledge that physical coercion was an accepted tool of justice created an atmosphere of pervasive fear for anyone accused, even of a minor offense. You were always aware that your body could be made to betray your words. The lack of written, formalized legal codes in a comprehensive sense like Hammurabi's Code often meant that the application of law could be somewhat arbitrary or based on local custom and the discretion of the presiding officials. While principles of ma'at justice, truth, balance guided their legal system, the interpretation and enforcement of these principles could vary. This meant that what constituted a minor crime or what punishment it warranted could be subjective. Leaving you vulnerable to the whims of the authorities, there was no detailed legal precedent you could cite, no specific statute to defend yourself against. One common misconception is that ancient Egyptian courts were entirely fair and impartial, guided by the divine principle of ma'at, While the ideal of Maat certainly inspired their justice system, the practical realities often fell short. Social status, wealth, political influence, and the discretionary power of officials could heavily influence court proceedings and outcomes, particularly for commoners facing accusations from elites. Justice, for the ordinary Egyptian, was often swift and heavily weighted towards maintaining social order rather than meticulously ensuring individual fairness. Historians still meticulously study surviving legal papyri like the Turin Judicial Papyrus, which details a tomb robbery trial, court records, and administrative documents to understand the precise mechanisms of ancient Egyptian law and its enforcement, often revealing a pragmatic system that prioritized state control and visible deterrence over extensive individual rights. Furthermore, the very act of being accused, even if you were ultimately found innocent, carried a significant social stigma. Your reputation in the community would be tarnished, gossip would spread, and distrust might linger. The public nature of the accusation and the trial meant that your personal ordeal became a matter of public knowledge, affecting your standing in the village or your ability to find future employment. This lasting social damage, even without formal punishment, added another layer of misery to your encounter with the law. The absence of an appeals process was also critical. Once a verdict was delivered by the local court, it was often final. There were very few avenues to challenge a decision, especially for a commoner. This meant that an unjust conviction or a punishment that seemed disproportionate to the crime had to be simply endured. Your fate was sealed by the initial judgment, leaving you with no recourse to seek higher justice or overturn a wrongful accusation. This finality of judgment, regardless of its fairness, made the entire process incredibly terrifying. So, your encounter with ancient Egyptian justice, even for a minor crime, was profoundly brutal because you faced no lawyers and no rights. You stood alone, helpless before the absolute authority of the state, subjected to biased proceedings, physical coercion, and the terrifying presumption of guilt. This complete lack of legal protection and the arbitrary nature of the system ensured that your path through the ancient Egyptian legal process was a terrifying, dehumanizing ordeal. Having stood helplessly before a legal system that denied you basic rights, you, the accused, now faced a grim escalation, the magistrate's fury, where beatings were a common method to extract confessions. Forget reasoned arguments or meticulous evidence. Your body became the battlefield where truth, or rather, what the authorities wanted as truth, was brutally forged. This physical coercion made ancient Egyptian justice profoundly brutal. Imagine the scene within the court, or perhaps in a secluded chamber of the administrative building. The atmosphere is tense, thick with the unspoken threat of violence. The magistrate or official, a stern figure of authority, sits before you. His patience is thin, his belief in your guilt perhaps already set. You have denied the accusation, perhaps timidly, perhaps defiantly. And now, the true nature of ancient Egyptian interrogation reveals itself. It truly sucked to be questioned with fists. The primary tool for extracting confessions was physical coercion, often in the form of beatings, while not always leading to torture in the most extreme sense, which was usually reserved for slaves or very serious crimes. The use of force was a common and accepted method to persuade the accused to admit guilt. Imagine being seized by guards, forced to the ground, and subjected to a beating with rods, sticks, or whips. The blows would rain down on your back, your legs, your feet, causing searing pain, tearing flesh, and leaving deep welts and bruises. The pain would be excruciating, designed to break your will and force a confession. Judicial papyri, ancient Egyptian legal documents, contain chilling evidence of this practice. Records explicitly state that individuals, including witnesses and the accused, were beaten with rods to extract testimony or confessions. This wasn't merely implied, it was a documented part of the legal process. Imagine the terror of hearing the magistrate's cold voice ordering the beating, knowing that your only escape from the agony was to utter the words they wanted to hear. Regardless of your actual innocence, it really sucked to literally beat the truth out of yourself. The purpose of these beatings was clear: to extract a confession. In ancient Egyptian legal thinking, a confession was often considered the most conclusive and irrefutable proof of guilt. It simplified the judicial process, eliminated the need for complex investigations, and provided undeniable evidence for the official record by forcing a confession. The authorities ensured a swift resolution and maintained the appearance of absolute justice, however brutally obtained. Your physical suffering was merely a means to an end, a tool to achieve administrative efficiency. The psychological impact of such physical coercion would be immense. The raw pain would be overwhelming, but the terror of knowing it would continue endlessly until you confessed would be even more profound. Your mind would race, desperate for relief, desperately trying to weigh the consequences of confessing to a crime you didn't commit against the agony of continued torture. This psychological torment, this battle against your own body's pain signals, would often lead to false confessions, as individuals would admit to anything just to make the suffering stop. Imagine sacrificing your truth to save your skin. It really sucked to confess to a lie. This method of justice inherently privileged the powerful. A wealthy or well-connected individual might be able to avoid such physical coercion through bribery or influence. But for you, the common peasant, your body was your only asset, and it was readily subjected to the will of the state. This made the system profoundly unfair, ensuring that the burden of harsh justice fell disproportionately on the shoulders of the poor and powerless. One common misconception is that ancient Egyptian justice was always guided by the abstract principle of ma'at, truth, justice, balance, and thus was inherently fair. While ma'at was the stated ideal and many officials strived for justice, the practical realities of a highly centralized authoritarian state often led to brutal methods, especially when dealing with the lower classes or perceived threats to order. The use of physical coercion and torture, though perhaps not universally applied to every minor crime, was an accepted, legal, and often efficient tool of the justice system, particularly for extracting information or confessions. Historians still meticulously studied judicial papyri and ostraca, inscribed pottery shards which document specific court cases and their outcomes, often finding explicit mention of physical punishments and interrogations that challenge purely idealized views of Egyptian justice. Furthermore, the lack of legal recourse for those subjected to such beatings was absolute. There was no one to complain to, no higher authority to appeal to, no independent body to investigate police brutality. The officials who beat you were the law, and their actions were sanctioned by the state. This complete absence of oversight ensured that such brutal methods could continue unchecked, a chilling testament to the unchecked power of the ancient Egyptian justice system. The physical consequences of these beatings could be severe and lasting beyond the immediate pain. You might suffer from internal injuries, broken bones, or deep lacerations that would fester in an unsanitary environment without modern medical care or antibiotics. These injuries could lead to chronic pain, permanent disability, or even a slow, agonizing death from infection. Your body, broken by the very system meant to deliver justice, would bear permanent scars, a visible reminder of your agonizing encounter with the law. The psychological toll of enduring such a beating, of having your dignity stripped away through physical violence, would be immense. You would live with the memory of the pain, the humiliation, and the profound injustice. This trauma would erode your trust in authority, breed a pervasive fear of the state, and leave you with deep emotional scars. Even if you were ultimately found innocent, your encounter with the magistrate's fury would forever define your understanding of justice. So, your journey through ancient Egyptian justice, even for a minor crime, quickly escalated to the magistrate's fury, where beatings were a common method to extract confessions. This brutal reality of physical coercion, designed to force a desired truth from your body regardless of actual guilt, made ancient Egyptian justice a profoundly brutal and terrifying ordeal, transforming your attempt to clear your name into a battle against agonizing, state-sanctioned violence. Having endured the magistrate's fury and the agonizing pain of a forced beating, your ordeal in ancient Egyptian justice often left a permanent, horrifying mark mutilation. Forget fines or simple imprisonment for minor crimes. Ancient Egypt favored public, physical disfigurement, designed to brand you for life and serve as a chilling warning to all who witnessed it, making your punishment profoundly brutal. Imagine the terrifying pronouncement of your sentence. If you were accused of theft, even a minor one, the traditional punishment for a repeat offender or for a particularly egregious act could be the severing of your nose. This wasn't a metaphorical or symbolic act. It was a literal, physical disfigurement performed publicly by an executioner or designated official. Imagine the searing pain, the immediate gush of blood, and the horrifying realization that a part of your face, your very identity, was gone forever. Your screams would echo in the public square, a chilling testament to the brutal efficiency of Egyptian justice. It truly sucked to lose your nose for a loaf of bread. The purpose of mutilation was stark and clear, permanent identification, and public deterrence. A person without a nose, or missing a hand, was instantly recognizable as a convicted criminal. This physical brand made it impossible for you to hide your past, to start a new life, or to escape the pervasive shame of your transgression. You were a living, breathing billboard of the state's power, a constant, horrifying example to everyone who saw you that crime would not go unpunished. And that defiance carried a visible, lifelong cost. Imagine walking through the market years later and seeing people recoil, whisper, or point at your disfigured face, a constant reminder of your shame. Beyond the nose, other forms of mutilation were employed depending on the crime. Loss of a hand for serious theft, particularly of temple property or imperial goods. The severing of a hand was a common punishment. This not only marked you as a thief, but also crippled your ability to perform manual labor. A devastating blow in an agrarian society where hands were vital for survival. Imagine trying to work the fields or craft goods with a missing limb, a constant, agonizing reminder of your crime and your reduced capacity. Loss of an ear or tongue for offenses like slander, perjury, or spreading sedition. The cutting off of an ear or even the tongue could be inflicted. These punishments were designed to physically silence or mark those who misuse their speech, serving as a chilling deterrent against dissent or dishonesty. Imagine being unable to hear properly or being unable to speak clearly. Condemned to a lifetime of impaired communication, blinding for certain severe crimes, particularly those involving a threat to the pharaoh or his agents. Blinding could be inflicted. This was the ultimate physical punishment, transforming a productive individual into a helpless burden, condemned to perpetual darkness. It was a complete eradication of a person's functionality and ability to engage with the world. The lack of proper medical care after such brutal mutilations compounded the horror. The wounds, crudely inflicted with unsterilized tools, would be susceptible to severe infection. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, a severed limb could fester, leading to rampant pus, fever, gangrene, and ultimately, a slow, agonizing death from sepsis. Many who survived the initial trauma of mutilation likely succumbed days or weeks later to infections that would be easily treatable today. Your punishment might not kill you immediately, but it often guaranteed a slow, painful demise. It really sucked to survive disfigurement only to die of infection. One common misconception is that ancient Egyptian justice was entirely based on restorative justice or simple fines. While fines and compensation were indeed used for some offenses, particularly those involving property or civil disputes, the state's ultimate authority, especially in the New Kingdom, relied heavily on visible, physical punishments, including mutilation, to maintain order and deter serious crime. The consistency of this practice across various judicial papyri and tomb depictions indicates it was a widespread and accepted part of their legal system, reflecting a harsh, pragmatic approach to crime deterrence. Historians still meticulously study judicial papyri like the Papyrus Abbot, detailing tomb robberies and administrative decrees to understand the precise application of different forms of physical punishment for various crimes. Furthermore, the psychological toll of such permanent disfigurement would be immense. You would live with an inescapable sense of shame, your body perpetually marked, forever an outsider, a walking testament to your past transgression. Your social interactions would be defined by people's revulsion or fear. Finding employment, forming relationships, or simply living a normal life would be incredibly difficult, as your very appearance would be a constant barrier. This psychological branding was perhaps as brutal as the physical act itself, ensuring a lifetime of profound misery. The public nature of these punishments reinforced their deterrent effect. These were spectacles, designed to terrify the populace and demonstrate the swift, unyielding power of the state and the pharaoh. Your suffering became a theatrical performance, your mutilated body a grim lesson for all who witnessed it. This blend of public humiliation and physical degradation was central to ancient Egyptian justice, making it profoundly effective in maintaining order through terror. So, your punishment for a minor crime in ancient Egypt was profoundly brutal because it often involved mutilation, a terrifying practice of physical disfigurement designed for permanent identification and public deterrence. The agony of the act, the subsequent risk of deadly infection, and the lifelong burden of physical and psychological scarring ensured that even a small transgression could result in a horrifying, permanent transformation, turning your body into a living monument to the harshness of ancient Egyptian justice. Having endured the humiliation of public disfigurement, your journey through ancient Egyptian justice now brought you to perhaps the most terrifying and prolonged punishment for minor crimes: forced labor. Forget brief imprisonments. You were condemned to a life of unrelenting toil in quarries, mines, or state projects, a slow, agonizing death sentence inflicted by the brutal demands of the empire, making your existence profoundly brutal. Imagine your new workplace. It wouldn't be a local farm or a familiar workshop. Instead, you'd be sent to one of the most arduous and dangerous labor sites in the empire, The quarries of Aswan, hacking out colossal blocks of granite under the scorching sun, the gold mines of Nubia, toiling in suffocating darkness and dust, or the construction sites of massive temples or irrigation canals, constantly moving immense weights of stone or earth. These were places of extreme physical demand, located in desolate, remote regions, far from any hope of escape or return to your former life. It truly sucked to become a human beast of burden. Your daily routine would be a relentless cycle of backbreaking labor from dawn till dusk. You'd be wielding heavy tools, picks, chisels, hammers, to break apart rock, or hauling immense weights of stone or earth. The work was physically destructive, designed to extract every ounce of your strength. Your muscles would scream in protest, your hands would be perpetually blistered and raw, and your back and joints would ache with chronic pain. This wasn't just hard work. It was a systematic process of breaking down your body, grinding it into submission day after day until you simply couldn't continue. The conditions were horrifying. In the quarries, you'd bake under the relentless desert sun, risking severe heat stroke and dehydration. Water, if available, would be scarce and often contaminated. In the mines, you'd toil in perpetual darkness, breathing air thick with dust and potentially lethal gases, risking suffocation or silent poisoning. Your living quarters in the labor camps would be crude, overcrowded, and utterly unsanitary, breeding grounds for disease, dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, and various fevers would sweep through the camps, rapidly debilitating and killing thousands. You would witness your comrades collapsing from exhaustion, succumbing to illness, or dying from horrific accidents, their bodies often unceremoniously discarded. It really sucked to be surrounded by death, all the time. Your diet would be meager and monotonous, barely enough to sustain your life, let alone fuel the immense physical exertion. You'd receive coarse grain, some pulses, and contaminated water, leading to chronic malnutrition and nutritional deficiencies like scurvy or anemia that would further weaken your body and compromise your immune system. You were perpetually hungry, perpetually thirsty, and constantly battling hidden ailments that would slowly consume you from within. The discipline was absolute and brutal, enforced by overseers wielding whips and cudgels without hesitation. Any perceived laziness, slowness, or defiance would be met with swift and agonizing physical punishment. Beatings, floggings, or even more severe tortures were common, designed to instill terror and ensure relentless productivity. Your body was not your own, it belonged to the state, a disposable tool to be exploited until it broke. The fear of the whip was a constant companion, driving you forward even when your body screamed for rest. It really sucked to be a human whip magnet. Escape was virtually impossible. These labor camps were often located in remote, desolate regions, miles from any civilization. Guards were omnipresent, and the surrounding wilderness itself served as a natural prison with no food, no water, and no familiar paths to guide a desperate fugitive. Any escape attempt would be met with swift and brutal retribution, often public execution designed to deter others. One common misconception is that forced labor in ancient Egypt was only for slaves or foreign captives, while slaves and prisoners of war certainly formed a large part of the workforce. Common Egyptian citizens could also be conscripted for forced labor known as corvée, labor for state projects like canal maintenance, pyramid building in earlier periods, or quarrying, often as a form of tax or civic duty. However, for those condemned for crimes, the severity and permanence of the labor, often for life, transformed it into a brutal form of capital punishment, a slow execution by toil Historians still meticulously study Egyptian administrative texts, quarry marks, and tomb depictions to understand the precise composition of labor forces for various state projects and the varying degrees of coercion applied to different social groups. Furthermore, the scale of these state projects, like the vast quarries or the immense temple complexes, meant that countless individuals were condemned to this life of forced labor. Your suffering was not unique. It was part of a mass system of exploitation, where millions of lives were systematically worked to death to build the infrastructure and monuments of the empire. This pervasive, systemic dehumanization ensured that the prosperity and grandeur of Egypt were quite literally built on the broken bodies of its condemned. The psychological toll of living such a life was immense. You were stripped of your identity, separated from your family, and faced with an existence utterly devoid of hope or personal freedom. The constant physical agony, the pervasive squalor, the daily fear, and the knowledge that your suffering would only end with death would lead to profound despair. Breaking your spirit as thoroughly as your body, your life was a testimony to unending misery, a living death sentence. So, your punishment for a minor crime in ancient Egypt was often a terrifying condemnation to forced labor. This brutal reality of unrelenting toil in quarries, mines, or state projects, enduring extreme conditions, malnutrition, disease, and constant physical abuse, was a defining, profoundly brutal aspect of ancient Egyptian justice. It was a slow, agonizing death sentence, ensuring that every monument and every resource of the empire was cemented not just with stone and gold, but with the anonymous suffering and shattered lives of countless condemned laborers. Even as your body was systematically broken down by forced labor and your spirit withered under the oppressive conditions. Your punishment in ancient Egypt often involved another profound and deeply unsettling torment: public humiliation. Forget quiet confinement. Ancient Egyptian justice frequently paraded your disgrace before the masses, turning your suffering into a theatrical spectacle designed to break your spirit and reputation, making your punishment profoundly brutal. Imagine the scene. You are not hidden away in a dungeon. Instead, you are brought to a public place, a busy market square, a temple courtyard, or a prominent street within the city. Your crime, however minor it might seem to us today, would be loudly announced by a herald or an official, perhaps exaggerating its severity. You might be shackled, bound, or even subjected to a specific form of public display designed to maximize your shame. Your audience is your entire community, your neighbors, your friends, perhaps even your family, all gathered to witness your profound disgrace. It truly sucked to be shamed in front of everyone. One common form of public humiliation was the stocks or the pillory. Imagine being confined in a wooden framework, your neck and wrists and sometimes ankles locked into holes, forcing you to stand or sit in an uncomfortable, exposed position for hours, or even days. You would be unable to move freely, unable to hide your face, utterly at the mercy of the public. Passers-by would gawk, whisper, and perhaps even hurl insults, rotten vegetables, or even stones at you. This wasn't just physical discomfort, it was a psychological assault, designed to strip you of your dignity and public standing. Your very body became a canvas for societal condemnation. It really sucked to be a human target practice. For some offenses, particularly those involving theft or moral transgressions, the humiliation might involve being paraded through the streets. You might be forced to wear a sign proclaiming your crime, or even carry an object related to your offense. Imagine being marched through the bustling city, surrounded by a jeering crowd, their eyes burning with judgment, their voices taunting you with epithets. Every step would be a public declaration of your downfall, a constant reminder of your shame. Your every muscle would tense. Your head would hang low, desperate to escape the relentless gaze of hundreds, all judging you. The purpose of public humiliation was clear deterrence and social control. By publicly shaming criminals, the state aimed to instill fear in potential wrongdoers and to reinforce social norms. It served as a stark, visible lesson to the populace about the consequences of defying the pharaoh's law. Your personal suffering was meticulously exploited for the benefit of maintaining order. The public spectacle ensured that your disgrace was widely known, affecting not just you, but implicitly your family and social circle, ensuring they too felt the ripple effect of your shame. Even if the punishment was relatively brief, the stigma would linger for a lifetime. Your reputation would be shattered. Your name would be synonymous with your crime. Finding employment, forming relationships, or simply living a normal life would be incredibly difficult. As your past disgrace would forever precede you, people would remember your public shaming, and their distrust or contempt would become a constant companion, ensuring that your punishment extended far beyond the stocks or the parade. It really sucked to be branded by public memory. One common misconception is that all ancient Egyptian punishments were physical and brutal, while physical punishments were common. Public humiliation served a distinct purpose by targeting a person's reputation and social standing, which were highly valued in ancient Egyptian society. The psychological impact of being publicly shamed could be as devastating, if not more so, than physical pain, leading to social ostracization and profound despair. Historians still meticulously study judicial papyri, tomb depictions which sometimes show scenes of punishment, and social commentaries to understand the precise forms and cultural significance of public humiliation in ancient Egypt, revealing how it served as a powerful tool of social enforcement. Furthermore, the very act of being a spectacle stripped you of your personal agency. You were no longer an individual. You were a prop in a state-sanctioned drama. Your body used to convey a message of power and control. Your emotional reactions, your pain, your humiliation, all were part of the performance. Consumed by a public eager for moral instruction and entertainment, this complete reduction to a mere object of display was a profound dehumanization, ensuring that your dignity was utterly destroyed. The psychological toll of enduring such public humiliation would be immense. You would live with the memory of the jeering crowds, the mocking whispers, and the feeling of utter powerlessness. This trauma would erode your self-worth, breed a profound sense of shame, and perhaps lead to deep depression or withdrawal. The feeling of having your personal dignity publicly ripped away would be a wound that never truly healed, making your life a perpetual struggle against your past. So, your punishment for a minor crime in ancient Egypt was profoundly brutal because it often involved public humiliation. Your disgrace was paraded before the masses, your body subjected to public display and ridicule, all designed to break your spirit and shatter your reputation, this agonizing spectacle. Ensuring your shame was widely known and long remembered was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of ancient Egyptian justice, making your suffering a chilling lesson for all who witnessed it. Even as your body bore the scars of the public humiliation and your spirit withered under forced labor, your punishment for minor crimes in ancient Egypt could drag you into another terrifying and often fatal arena, the water's edge. Forget the life-giving Nile. its sacred waters could become an instrument of suffering, from endless toil in its depths to symbolic drowning, making your ordeal profoundly brutal. Imagine yourself condemned to labor near or in the very waters of the Nile. This wasn't the gentle, fertile river depicted in tomb paintings. This was a place of endless, dangerous toil. You might be forced to work in the muddy, often swift currents of the river. Assisting with irrigation projects, this could involve dredging silt from canals to maintain water flow, hauling heavy baskets of mud onto the banks, or constantly reinforcing fragile irrigation ditches. The water itself, teeming with microscopic life, animal waste, and decaying vegetation, would be a constant source of disease. You would be perpetually exposed to pathogens causing dysentery, schistosomiasis, a parasitic infection causing debilitating internal organ damage, and various fevers. Your skin would be constantly wet, prone to infection, and your body perpetually tired from fighting the currents. It truly sucked to have your life-giving river be your death trap. For those condemned to quarrying along the Nile's banks, your labor would be even more perilous. You'd be working in treacherous, slippery conditions, hacking at stone near the water's edge. A single misstep could send you plummeting into the river, your heavy tools dragging you down into its depths. The danger of drowning, especially if you were shackled or exhausted, was ever present. And even if you were a strong swimmer, the currents could be unforgiving, sweeping you away from your work gang and into the unknown. Beyond the physical labor, the Nile could be used as a place of symbolic punishment or execution, while less common for minor crimes than for major ones or rebellious slaves. The threat of the river was omnipresent. Imagine being tied to a heavy stone and thrown into the deep, dark currents. Your life quickly extinguished by the sacred waters you once revered. This method of execution, while swift, was particularly terrifying because it often meant your body would never be recovered, denying you a proper burial and, therefore, a peaceful afterlife according to Egyptian belief. This was a profound spiritual degradation designed to erase your existence entirely. It really sucked to literally vanish in the river. The use of the Nile in punishment also highlighted its dual nature in ancient Egyptian cosmology. While it was the source of all life and fertility, revered as a deity itself, it could also be a force of destruction and judgment. This duality underscored the absolute power of the pharaoh and the gods to inflict suffering. Even through the most vital elements of nature, your punishment, therefore, was intertwined with the very fabric of the Egyptian worldview, a chilling reminder of divine and earthly authority. One common misconception is that the Nile was always a pristine, calm river. In reality, the Nile's annual inundation was a powerful, often destructive, force, bringing both fertility and danger. Its currents could be strong, its banks treacherous, and its waters, especially near settlements, were heavily polluted by human and animal activity. This made working in or near the river inherently dangerous. Regardless of the explicit punishments, historians still meticulously study ancient Egyptian texts like the Satire of the Trades, which often contrast the hard life of laborers and archaeological findings of ancient irrigation systems to understand the specific dangers and demands of working with the Nile's waters, confirming its dual role as life-giver and potential killer. Furthermore, the wildlife of the Nile added another layer of terror. Crocodiles, while perhaps not as prevalent in heavily populated areas as in more remote sections, were still a formidable threat in ancient Egypt. To be forced to work in their habitat, or to be cast into the river as punishment, meant facing these ancient predators, adding a visceral primal fear to your ordeal. Imagine the terrifying thought of being dragged under by a hidden beast, your screams muffled by the churning water. The supervision of labor along the Nile was often harsh. Overseers, armed with whips, would drive the condemned laborers relentlessly, ensuring maximum output. The constant pressure, combined with the physical demands of working in the water, made escape or even a moment's rest almost impossible. Your life was utterly consumed by the river's demands, pushing your body to its absolute limits. Day after day, the psychological toll of constantly being exposed to the dangers of the Nile, of knowing that its waters could be your grave, would be immense. You would live with a perpetual sense of dread, your body aching, your skin raw, your mind consumed by the fear of drowning, disease, or attack. This daily confrontation with a life-giving force transformed into an instrument of punishment would erode your spirit, leaving you perpetually fearful and utterly miserable. So, your punishment for a minor crime in ancient Egypt could drag you to the water's edge, transforming the sacred Nile into an instrument of profound suffering, whether through endless, disease-ridden toil in its currents or the terrifying prospect of symbolic drowning. Your ordeal in the river's embrace was a defining, profoundly brutal aspect of ancient Egyptian justice, ensuring that even the life-giving waters became a source of constant peril and slow, agonizing degradation, even as your body suffered the relentless torment of forced labor or the indignity of public shame. Your life in ancient Egypt was perpetually overshadowed by the most absolute and terrifying source of punishment, the pharaoh's word. Forget due process, legal appeals, or even established laws. The king's arbitrary will could override any semblance of justice, leading to instant, brutal sentences that made your encounter with the law profoundly brutal. Imagine the terrifying reality of living under an absolute monarch, a ruler considered a living god, the pharaoh or his direct representatives, like a vizier, wielded supreme power over every aspect of Egyptian life, including its justice system. While formalized courts existed for many offenses, the pharaoh's direct intervention, his personal decree, or even a simple, unchallengeable command could instantly seal your fate, regardless of the severity of your alleged crime or any existing legal precedent. Your life, your limbs, your very existence hinged on his whim. It truly sucked to have your fate decided by a god who could be in a bad mood. The pharaoh's word was law, supreme and unquestionable if he heard of a crime. If he was displeased with an official, or if a particular offense was deemed a direct affront to his divine authority, he could issue a decree directly. This meant instant sentencing. There would be no lengthy trials, no collection of evidence, no opportunity for defense. A simple accusation reaching the pharaoh's ear could result in an immediate verdict and sentence, disproportionate punishment, a minor infraction. If it angered the pharaoh, could be met with an incredibly severe punishment that far exceeded its typical legal consequence. A perceived act of disrespect might lead to mutilation or even death. Rather than a beating or a fine, arbitrary justice, the pharaoh's decisions might be influenced by personal feelings, political considerations, or the advice of favored courtiers, rather than strict adherence to established legal principles. This made justice unpredictable and terrifyingly capricious. You never knew what might offend him or what seemingly minor act could spark his wrath. It really sucked to be a subject in a divine dictatorship. Consider the famous example of the tomb robberies in the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom. These were capital offenses, often punished with extreme brutality. While formal trials were sometimes held, the pharaoh's direct interest in the security of royal tombs meant that he could personally intervene, demanding swift and severe retribution for those caught or even suspected of such crimes. The fear of the pharaoh's personal vengeance for a sacrilege against his eternal resting place would be immense, even for offenses that might otherwise be handled by local courts. The pharaoh's direct interest could elevate the severity of the punishment. Imagine a local official simply asking for a beating for your petty theft. But then a royal inspector, reporting directly to the vizier, catches wind of it and decides to make an example of you, securing a royal decree for mutilation or forced labor. Your life was constantly under the potential shadow of a higher, more absolute authority. This ultimate power meant that even the highest officials and judges were subservient to the pharaoh's will. They would not question his decisions, and would meticulously carry out his brutal decrees, for fear of incurring his wrath themselves. Your entire society, from the lowest peasant to the highest minister, lived under the chilling awareness that the supreme law of the land was one man's absolute will, often unpredictable and unchallengeable. One common misconception is that ancient Egyptian pharaohs were constantly issuing arbitrary death sentences or mutilations while their power was absolute. Many pharaohs strove to maintain the appearance of being just rulers, upholding Ma'at cosmic order and justice. However, their system allowed for extreme cruelty when deemed necessary, particularly for offenses against the state, religion, or the pharaoh himself. The examples of extreme punishments like impalement or burning alive for treason found in historical records, though perhaps not daily occurrences, served as powerful deterrents, underscoring the potential for the pharaoh's swift and brutal justice. Historians still meticulously study judicial papyri that detail royal decrees on punishment and the accounts of specific trials to understand the precise ways in which the pharaoh's ultimate authority shaped the practical application of law. Furthermore, the very deification of the pharaoh contributed to the brutality of the system. As a living god, his word carried divine weight. Defying his command, however minor the transgression, was not just a legal offense, but an act of sacrilege, warranting retribution that was often seen as divine justice. This fusion of political and religious authority meant that the pharaoh's anger was not just a ruler's displeasure, but a god's wrath, making his punishments all the more terrifying and legitimate in the eyes of the populace. The psychological toll of living under such an absolute power would be immense. You would live with a perpetual sense of vulnerability, knowing that your life could be irrevocably altered or ended by a single decree from the highest authority, without warning or recourse. This constant, underlying fear, this awareness of your utter powerlessness, would shape your every action, your every word, forcing you into a life of cautious obedience and suppressed defiance. Your very existence was a constant performance, hoping to avoid the unpredictable wrath of your divine ruler. So, your punishment for a minor crime in ancient Egypt was profoundly brutal, because your fate was always at the mercy of the pharaoh's word. His absolute and unquestionable will could override any semblance of law, leading to instant, disproportionate, and often arbitrary sentences that transformed your life into a terrifying display of his power. This ultimate, centralized authority, embodied in a living God, ensured that your encounter with ancient Egyptian justice was a constant, terrifying dance with unpredictable, unchallengeable brutality, even as your body suffered the relentless torment of the pharaoh's will and the brutal consequences of justice. A glimmer of desperate hope might still flicker within you escape. Forget an easy path to freedom. Attempting to flee ancient Egyptian punishment was a terrifying gamble with almost impossible odds, making your life profoundly brutal in its ultimate lack of true liberation. Imagine your situation. You have been accused, perhaps beaten, possibly mutilated, or condemned to forced labor. The prospect of endless suffering, a slow death in a quarry, or a lifetime of public shame would be overwhelming. Your mind, desperate for any alternative, would inevitably turn to the terrifying thought of flight. But the ancient Egyptian state was a highly organized and ruthless power, designed to ensure that no one, especially a condemned criminal, could simply disappear. It truly sucked to be a fugitive in ancient Egypt. The physical environment itself was a formidable prison. Egypt was a land defined by the narrow, fertile strip of the Nile River, bordered on either side by vast, unforgiving deserts. If you attempted to flee eastward, you would face the scorching sands of the Arabian Desert, a barren wasteland with little water or sustenance, where death by exposure or thirst was almost guaranteed. Westward lay the equally daunting Libyan Desert, a boundless expanse of sand and rock. Offering no refuge, your only path was along the Nile, but that meant navigating heavily populated areas, constantly under the watchful eye of local authorities and royal patrols. Imagine running into an endless, burning wasteland. Your only hope a mirage. It really sucked to have your escape route be a death trap. The reach of the state was immense and pervasive. Egypt was a highly centralized society, with a vast bureaucracy, a disciplined military, and a pervasive network of officials and scribes who meticulously recorded every aspect of life. Passports, travel documents for officials or merchants were common, and travelers were regularly checked at checkpoints along the Nile or at provincial borders. If you were a condemned criminal, your description, your crime, and any identifying marks, especially if you had been mutilated, would be circulated among local authorities. Fugitives were actively hunted, their names recorded, and their faces, if known, remembered. There was literally nowhere to hide in such a meticulously controlled state. It really sucked to be a wanted man in a surveillance state. Security at forced labor camps was exceptionally tight, whether in quarries, mines, or on massive construction projects. You would be surrounded by armed guards, often soldiers, who operated with brutal efficiency. Camps would be fortified with walls, watchtowers, and constant patrols. Minors might even be shackled or chained, especially during transit or while working in groups. Any attempt to flee would be met with immediate and overwhelming force. And in the brutal punishments for escape attempts, often public execution or severe mutilation served as terrifying deterrents. Imagine trying to sneak past dozens of armed, ruthless guards, knowing that capture meant agony and a public death. The lack of resources further undermined any escape attempt. As a condemned laborer, you would have no money, no food, no water, and no weapons. You would be utterly dependent on what you could scavenge or steal, making your flight incredibly perilous. The fear of starvation and thirst would be as potent as the fear of recapture. Furthermore, you would have no network of sympathizers, no underground railroad to aid your escape. Those caught aiding a condemned criminal would face severe penalties themselves. This forced you into absolute self-reliance, with almost no chance of success. It really sucked to be poor and on the run. One common misconception is that ancient societies, due to less advanced technology, were easier to escape from than modern ones. In reality, highly centralized and agrarian empires like ancient Egypt, with their dense populations concentrated along rivers, their reliance on detailed record-keeping, and their pervasive state control, could be incredibly effective at tracking and capturing fugitives. The vast, empty deserts served as natural, inescapable prisons, funneling fugitives towards guarded choke points along the Nile or trapping them in a deadly wilderness. Historians still meticulously study Egyptian administrative papyri that detail fugitive slave lists, legal records of escape attempts, and military reports on border patrols to understand the precise mechanisms of state control and the challenges faced by those attempting to flee. Furthermore, the psychological toll of being a fugitive would be immense. You would live in a perpetual state of paranoia, constantly looking over your shoulder, unable to trust anyone. Every stranger's glance, every distant sound, every moment of perceived freedom would be tainted by the fear of recapture. Sleep would be fitful, plagued by nightmares of your former tormentors. This relentless anxiety, this constant awareness of being hunted, would chip away at your sanity, making your desperate bid for freedom a profound psychological torture in itself. Even if you miraculously managed to evade capture for a period, the quality of your freedom would be grim. You would live on the fringes of society, an outlaw unable to work legally, constantly hiding, and never truly secure. Your existence would be a constant struggle for mere survival, forever shadowed by the memory of your past punishment and the omnipresent threat of rediscovery. This was not liberation, it was a different, equally brutal form of confinement, a life of perpetual fear and destitution. So, your life under ancient Egyptian law was profoundly brutal, because even the desperate hope of escaping justice was a terrifying gamble with almost impossible odds. The formidable physical environment, the pervasive reach of the state, the brutal efficiency of its enforcement, and the utter lack of resources conspired to ensure that any attempt to flee your punishment would likely lead to a swift, agonizing recapture, or a lonely death in the wilderness, sealing your fate to an inescapable legacy of suffering. You've endured the chilling accusation, faced the terror of a legal system without rights, suffered the magistrate's brutal fury and forced confessions, borne the permanent scars of public mutilation, wasted away under the agonizing toil of forced labor, been stripped of your dignity through public humiliation, feared the Nile's waters as an instrument of punishment, and lived under the ultimate, arbitrary will of the pharaoh, with any hope of escape being a terrifying, almost impossible gamble as the phantom pain subsides and the echoes of ancient justice finally fade. A profound, chilling truth settles upon you. Ancient Egyptian justice, even for minor crimes, was a brutal system built on fear, coercion, and profound human cost, leaving a cruel legacy of order through terror. Consider the absolute power of the state in ancient Egypt. Unlike many other societies that might have separate legal and religious authorities, in Egypt, the pharaoh was the living embodiment of divine will, the very link between humanity and the gods. His word was supreme law, making any transgression, however minor, an affront to cosmic order, ma'at. This divine authority allowed for punishments that were incredibly harsh, swift, and seemingly arbitrary, as they were perceived to be direct manifestations of divine justice, not mere human retribution. This fusion of political and religious authority ensured an unchallengeable system of control. It truly sucked to have your justice system run by a literal god on earth. The core principle behind this brutality was deterrence. Ancient Egypt, with its vast population and complex social structure, relied heavily on visual and physical deterrence to maintain strict order and obedience. Punishments were often public beatings in the marketplace, mutilations for all to see, executions at prominent sites. Your suffering, if condemned, was not just about retribution for your crime. It was a carefully orchestrated spectacle, a chilling lesson to all who witnessed it. The state aimed to instill a pervasive fear that would compel compliance and suppress dissent, ensuring that every citizen understood the dire consequences of even minor infractions. Your pain was a public service announcement, etched in the memories of your community. The lack of legal rights and representation was fundamental to this brutal system. As a commoner, you stood alone before the courts, presumed guilty, with no lawyer to defend you, no right to appeal, and often no opportunity to present counter-evidence, confessions, often extracted through physical coercion or torture, were prized as ultimate proof of guilt, simplifying the judicial process at a horrifying human cost. This complete powerlessness in the face of authority ensured that justice was efficient, but rarely fair, especially for the poor and the marginalized. It really sucked to be helpless before the law. The physical brutality inflicted was a defining characteristic. Beatings with rods, mutilation, severing of nose, hand, ear, or blinding. And forced labor in quarries or mines were common for a range of offenses. These weren't quick punishments, they were designed to inflict prolonged agony, permanent disfigurement, and often a slow, agonizing death. Your body became the battlefield where truth was brutally forged and where the state left its permanent mark. The sheer violence normalized suffering, making it an accepted part of the justice system. And then there was the psychological warfare, the constant threat of arbitrary punishment, the fear of the pharaoh's unpredictable wrath, the public humiliation that shattered your dignity and reputation, and the profound isolation of forced labor, all combined to erode your spirit. You lived with a pervasive sense of dread, always aware of your vulnerability, always fearing the swift, unquestionable hand of justice. This mental anguish, this constant battle against despair, was as brutal as any physical torment, leaving deep, lasting scars on your psyche. It truly sucked to be terrified into obedience. The very landscape of Egypt became a canvas for this brutal justice. The scorching deserts were inescapable prisons. The Nile, a life-giver, could also be a place of punishment and anonymous death. The vast quarries and mines, built by forced labor, stood as silent monuments to countless condemned lives. Every part of the environment echoed the state's relentless power and its capacity for cruelty. One particularly poignant and often overlooked detail is the role of record-keeping in this brutal system. Ancient Egyptian scribes meticulously documented court proceedings, lists of punishments, and registers of forced laborers. These seemingly dry administrative texts, unearthed by archaeologists, provide chilling evidence of the systematic nature of this brutality. They list the number of beatings, the specific mutilations inflicted, and the length of forced labor sentences with detached precision, transforming human suffering into mere data points. This administrative efficiency, applied to human exploitation, underscores the cold, calculated nature of ancient Egyptian justice. Historians still meticulously study these legal papyri and ostrata to understand the precise categories of crime, the varying degrees of punishment, and the systematic application of force in maintaining social order. Furthermore, the lack of any effective appeal system meant that once a sentence was delivered, especially by a high official or the pharaoh, it was final. There was little to no recourse for the accused, ensuring that any injustice or error could not be rectified. This ultimate finality of judgment, regardless of its fairness, made the entire legal process incredibly terrifying and profoundly unjust for those caught within its gears. The enduring legacy of fear permeated Egyptian society for millennia. Generations lived under the shadow of this brutal justice, learning early to respect authority, to obey laws, and to avoid any actions that might incur the pharaoh's wrath. This system, while abhorrent by modern standards, was undeniably effective in maintaining a highly stable and centralized empire for thousands of years, demonstrating the profound and terrible power of order enforced through terror. So, your encounter with ancient Egyptian law, even for a minor crime, was a profound and constant lesson in the brutal reality of its justice system. It was a cruel legacy built on unchecked power, pervasive superstition, and the systematic infliction of pain and degradation. Your suffering, your disfigurement, your forced labor, or your anonymous death, all served as chilling examples, ensuring that the majestic order of ancient Egypt was maintained, but at a profound and terrible human cost paid by countless anonymous lives. As you now drift into a deep, comforting sleep, let the distant whispers of ancient decrees and the phantom ache of old wounds finally fade into the quiet background of history. You are safe, in your own time, far removed from the brutal realities of ancient justice. May your dreams be peaceful, filled with the quiet certainty of due process, human rights, and the profound comfort of a legal system that strives for rehabilitation. A stark contrast to the brutal truth we've explored tonight. And now, good night, and have sweet dreams.